Today's episode discusses the death of individuals. If this sort of thing upsets you, this is not the episode for you. May I suggest you watch a movie, maybe something like Mary Poppins.
Welcome to Mayhem in the Morgue, with your host, Dr. Kendall Crowns.
Today's episode, What's the Manner? Today, we're going to be discussing the manner of death. On death certificates, there are two main things that a forensic pathologist must fill out, and these are cause and manner of death. The cause of death is a specific disease process or injury that initiates a sequence of events that results in death. The cause of death is the answer to why the person died. It simplifies the complex mechanism or how the death occurred. For example, the cause of death, strangulation. Let's look at the underlying mechanism. An assailant places hands forcefully on a victim's neck, creating pressure that collapses the jugular veins, the carotid arteries, the trachea, or even the vertebral arteries. This results in oxygen or oxygenated blood not getting to the brain. If the pressure is held for several minutes, the brain dies from the lack of oxygen, also known as anoxic encephalopathy. That is way too much to put on a death certificate. So the cause of death distills this mechanism all into one word: strangulation. The cause of death can be an infinite number of different things. It's an endless variety of possibilities. It can be heart attacks, gunshot wounds, struck by a meteor, stab wounds, eaten by hamsters, cancer, strokes, you name it. The language can be vague, like choking, or specific, like choked on a piece of meat. And in the end, it's really dependent on the jurisdiction. The manner of death is a classification on how the cause of death came about. It's based on the circumstances leading up to and surrounding the death found by the death investigators, the autopsy findings, and other subsequent investigation and laboratory findings. It's an opinion made by the forensic pathologist and can be typically one of 5 things. And these are natural, accident, suicide, homicide, and undetermined. And before we proceed, let's go through each of these and define them. The National Association of Medical Examiners, or NAME, put out a guide for the manner of death classification. In this guide, it defines each of the manners as well as discusses potential issues with manner of death classifications. So let's go through the definitions of each of the manners as laid out by the NAME guidebook. Let's start with natural. Natural is defined as a death solely due to or nearly totally due to a disease and or the aging process. Next is accident. It's defined as an injury or poisoning that causes death, and there is little to no evidence the injury or poisoning occurred with the intent to cause harm or death. Suicide is classified as an injury or poisoning as a result of an intentional, self-inflicted act committed to do self-harm or cause death of oneself. Homicide is defined as occurring when death results from a volitional act committed by another person to cause fear, harm, or death. The guide further states about homicide that intent to cause death is a common element, but is not required for classification as a homicide. Finally, there's undetermined. It is a classification made when the information pointing to one manner of death is no more compelling than one or more other competing manners of death, in thorough consideration of all available information. To me, it's a wastebasket category. When we just can't figure out what it is, we use undetermined. Typically, at a medical examiner's office, the most common manner of death is natural. It usually makes up more than half of the manners of death, which makes sense because statistically, you're more likely to die from a natural disease. And the most common natural disease is a heart attack, or more specifically, hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. The next most common one is accident, and this one is nearly half as well. And that's because car accidents, simple falls, things of that are very common occurrences. The next is usually suicide, with a small percentage of homicides. And finally, the lowest percentage is undetermined. Because at a medical examiner's office, we strive to find an exact manner of death in every case, and we only use undetermined when we've exhausted all other possibilities. The thing about manner of death is not every case is clear-cut, and it often takes some lengthy consideration and a lot of investigation and tests to get a final answer. And even when you get that final answer, your colleagues may not necessarily agree with you. And on today's episode, we'll be going over different cases of mine where the manner of death wasn't so clear-cut, and it was up for debate. So let's get started. The first case we'll go over was a multiple fatality car collision. It was a warm, sunny summer day in a suburb of Chicago. There was a group of friends that were going out on their lunch break from their job at an audio technology company. They were sitting in a Honda Civic at a stoplight, waiting for it to turn green. Little did they know they would never see the light change. A red Mustang came rocketing up at a speed that was calculated at 87 miles per hour and struck their car from behind. The Honda pitched forward, striking the car in front of it, and both cars flew reportedly 10 feet into the air. The Honda then continued rolling nearly 50 feet before coming to a stop, resting on its roof. The rear seat passenger of the Honda was ejected on impact through the front window and into the street, dying almost instantly. The other occupants of the Honda didn't fare much better. One died instantly, and the other shortly after arriving at the hospital. The Mustang flipped into the air and landed on its roof, sliding several feet down the street. Its sole occupant was hanging upside down in her car by her seatbelt and was heard screaming by witnesses and the paramedics, "Oh my God, get me out of here." She was rescued by the paramedics and taken to the same hospital as the other individuals who were pronounced dead. She was treated, and the only injury she had was a broken right ankle. The 3 individuals who died from the Honda were brought to the medical examiner's office and were assigned to me the next day. When these types of multiple fatalities come in, they are usually given to one doctor to take care of. Unless it's something like 8 or 9 individuals or more, then it has to be split up amongst several doctors. And this is because when these cases go to court, you don't want multiple doctors tied up. You want to just keep it to one. But of course, you have to be reasonable. When I did the autopsies, the cause of deaths were pretty straightforward. Each individual had blunt force injuries, abrasions, lacerations, bruises about the bodies, fractures of the skull, cervical spine, rib fractures, fractures of the pelvis, lacerations and contusions of the organs, hemorrhage in the chest cavities and abdominal cavities. It was simple. The cause of death of each of them was multiple blunt force injuries. And the manner of death I initially thought would be straightforward as well, which would have been accident, because it was just a car collision. But when I was finishing the third autopsy, investigating officers showed up with additional information. They told me the driver of the car, the Mustang, that collided with the Honda, stated she was attempting to commit suicide by ramming her car into the other car. The detectives said that she couldn't find any train tracks to park her car on to be hit by a train, and when she was driving down the road, she saw the car stopped at a stoplight, and she targeted it. She pressed her right foot down on the accelerator to the floor of the Mustang and sped as fast as she could towards the Honda. She stated she didn't want to hurt anyone else, just herself. She may have been attempting suicide, but she did it by ramming her car into another car that she knew had people in it. And she had to know, at that speed, she was putting their lives at risk as well. And she was using her car as a weapon, intentionally hitting them. It was no different than if she had taken a loaded gun and pointed it into a crowd and started pulling the trigger. So with this information, I made the manner of death homicide, because it best fit the definition of homicide, which again is defined as a volitional act committed by another person to cause fear, harm, or death. And it was a volitional act to crash her car into the other car that resulted in those individuals' death. At the time I worked in Chicago, there were several other doctors who worked at the office. Some felt it could be an accident because she didn't intend to harm them. She was just intending to harm herself. But the majority of the doctors agreed she had intentionally hit the other car, knowing full well she could cause the other people's death, and did not care. The case was closed. All 3 individuals were signed out as blunt force injuries as the cause of death, and manner of death, homicide. There are many questions as to why she did it. Was it mental health issues? Was it drugs? Or was it something else? It even became an episode of the show Snapped on the Oxygen Network. And if you want to see more details, I recommend you look it up and watch it. When it went to trial, all these issues became part of it. She was finally found guilty and charged with reckless homicide and sentenced to 8 years in prison. and was released after only serving about half the sentence. After she was released, there was a fair amount of outrage. She received death threats, and last I heard, she had moved out of the area. But I don't know much about her after this. But I know I still, to this day, think the manner of death is homicide. Another type of case that we see routinely is individuals playing Russian roulette. If you don't know what Russian roulette is, well, that's a good thing. But unfortunately, now you're going to learn about it. It's a game, and it's a simple game. You take a revolver, typically one that has 6 chambers, put one bullet in the chamber, spin the cylinder, place the barrel next to your head, and pull the trigger. So you have a 1 in 6 chance of dying. And if you survive, you get to play again and spin the chamber again. And each time you survive, your chances of living to see the next round go down. Where did Russian roulette come from? There's a lot of theories about it, but there's no one specific one. Some say it's a game played by the Tsarist army to impress onlookers. Others say it was a form of punishment in Russian prisons. It's found in different novels and different articles and stories. And of course, it's used as a popular deadly game in many a TV show and movie. Where it came from is not really clear, but the reality is, it's around and people play it periodically. There's one variant that I found in Texas, which is called redneck Russian roulette. In that case, the individual loaded a semi-automatic pistol with a clip with a single bullet, put the gun to his head, and said, "I'm playing redneck Russian roulette," pulled the trigger. And of course, he shot himself, because in redneck Russian roulette, you have a 100% chance of being shot by the bullet you just loaded. Russian roulette always becomes a debate amongst medical examiners. Some feel you're playing a game. You have a 1 in 6 chance of dying, but you're still playing a game, and you didn't mean to intentionally kill yourself. And they would label it an accident. Others feel you placed a loaded gun to your head with a 1 in 6 chance of dying and pulled the trigger, and they feel that fits suicide. So is it suicide or is it an accident? Problem is, you can debate this all day long, and the medical examiners that fall on suicide and the ones that fall on the side of accident will never come to an agreement. It's even addressed in the name guidebook, which states, Russian roulette or similar variants may be classified as suicide because the act of placing a loaded gun to the head and pulling the trigger is inherently dangerous, carries a high risk of death, and implies subintent to do self-harm or accept the risk of serious injury or death. Guns are generally regarded as lethal weapons and are inherently lethal if misused. Knowledge of this fact is part of the reason the game is played. Attempting to determine the victim's state of mind and intent are extremely difficult. Classification of such deaths as suicide provides for a consistent approach and reflects the most common practice. In all of the cases I have ever had of individuals playing Russian roulette, I have always signed the manner of death as suicide. Let's move on to another case. This one is about long-term consequences. In this case, it was a 65-year-old female. She was a homeless woman found dead on a mattress in an alleyway. I did the autopsy. She was well-developed, thin female, appearing way older than her stated age. She had scars on her abdomen that looked like she had had extensive abdominal surgery at one point in her life, and internally she had dense fibrous adhesions along her intestines. Adhesions are fibrous tissue on the outside of the intestinal walls that cause the loops of the bowel to stick to each other. Adhesions are the result of surgeries or trauma to the abdominal cavity. Also, her pancreas didn't look right. We only had the medical records from the paramedics at the time of autopsy, and her case was made pending. And I waited on toxicologic findings, and I also did histology. When her toxicology came back, she had the breakdown product of cocaine called benzoyl in her blood. She also had an elevated vitreous glucose and acetone. First off, vitreous. It's a fluid in your eyeball that will extract at the time of autopsy, and it's a great source for testing for alcohol as well as electrolytes, which are sodium, potassium, and chloride, and then we can also check kidney functions as well. The other thing vitreous can show you is glucose, and in some instances, it will even show acetone. Glucose is, of course, the sugar in your body, And acetone is a volatile organic compound produced by the body during the breakdown of fats, when the body is trying to find alternate energy sources. And both of these, an elevated glucose and acetone present in the vitreous, are markers for diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA. DKA is a complication of typically type 1 diabetes. It develops when the body doesn't have enough insulin, leading to high blood sugar levels and the breakdown of fat for energy, which produces harmful chemicals in the body called ketones, which show up as acetone in postmortem testing. And when diabetic ketoacidosis occurs, it causes confusion and eventually nausea, vomiting, which results in dehydration, which leads to organ failure, and finally, death. So we had a few findings: markedly elevated blood glucose and acetone, and benzoylecgonine. Thing about the benzoylecgonine, it's a breakdown product of cocaine, and it can be in your system for days. So we had findings, but we had no reason for the findings. I had no medical history on this individual. We had to get more information to figure out what had happened with her. So investigations dug a little deeper and got medical records on her. When the medical records came in, she did have a history of cocaine abuse, but she also had a history of insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus that was poorly controlled. When I reviewed this further, I found out she had developed diabetes in her 20s after an incident. And that incident was she had been involved in an altercation in which a person stabbed her in the abdomen, damaging her intestines and transecting her pancreas. The subsequent surgeries that had to be performed damaged her pancreas further, and she ended up with diabetes from that point forward. So now I had a reason why she had DKA. She did have the breakdown product of cocaine in her system. That may have meant she had used cocaine the day before, or maybe longer. But what had actually killed her was her diabetes. Her cause of death wasn't even straightforward. She wasn't just a simple diabetic who was found dead in an alleyway. She was instead a complex case of an individual who had been stabbed in the abdomen years before, developing diabetes, and then dying from it. Whether the cocaine played a part or not was insignificant, so the cause of death was complications of a stab wound to the abdomen. Now the next thing was the manner. Even though she died of diabetes, it wasn't a natural, and it also wasn't an accident. It was a homicide. And this reflects the but-for principle, which is outlined again in the name guidebook, which states, the but-for principle is commonly applicable. But for the injury or hostile environment, would the person have died when he or she did? This logic is often cited as a simple way to determine whether a death should be classified as natural or non-natural, meaning homicide, suicide, or accident. When an injury or poisoning is involved in the cause of death, an answer of yes supports a natural death, and an answer of no should prompt due consideration to be given to a non-natural manner of death. The certifier needs to recognize, however, that the intermingling of natural and non-natural factors presents a set of complex considerations in assigning a manner of death, regardless of whether the non-natural factor A unequivocally precipitated death, B exacerbated an underlying natural pathologic condition, C produced a natural condition that constitutes the immediate cause of death, or D contributed to the death of a person with natural disease typically survivable in a non-hostile environment. This principle remains: the manner of death is unnatural when injury hastens the death of one already vulnerable to significant or even life-threatening disease. So with that in mind, but for the stab wound to the abdomen, she may have never developed diabetes and would not have died from it. The person who actually stabbed her had gone to prison for stabbing her years ago and had died in the meantime. There would be no further prosecution in this case. Had this individual been alive and serving prison time when she died, I am not sure how that would have changed things. That's a question for our lawyer friends. Anyway, we do get these occasionally. Someone is shot, becomes a paraplegic or quadriplegic, and they're wheelchair-bound or bed-bound, develop bed sores. Those sores get infected, and they eventually die from sepsis or pneumonia. And it all goes back to the fact that they had been shot or stabbed or whatever years before. And it changes things from a natural disease process to a homicide. Because, but for that injury, That person would have never been a quadriplegic, paraplegic, or a diabetic, and would have died from something else. And that brings us to the final case. This case was an 18-year-old college student. She was found dead on the first day of classes. The night before, her parents had driven her up to the university, taken her out to dinner with her friend and roommate, dropped her off at the dorm, said their goodbyes, and left. The roommates said they watched TV for a little while and then went to their separate rooms. The next day, when she was getting ready for class, she noticed her friend's door was shut and her light was on. When her friend didn't come out, she knocked on the door with no response. When she opened the door, she saw her friend laying in bed with her pajamas on, book on her chest, glasses on her face, and unresponsive. When she couldn't get a response out of her, she called 911. When paramedics arrived, they said she had been dead for hours. She had no medical history, no known drug use, and had never drank alcohol. When I did the autopsy, she was a well-developed, well-nourished female, appearing the reported age. Internally, she had nothing. No congestion, no edema of the lungs, heart was normal, everything was normal. I did toxicology, I did vitreous electrolytes. I did all the lab tests that I had available at that time. I also did histology, looked at everything under the microscope, and then in the end, I had no findings, no answers. I just could not figure it out. And that is why that case was closed as cause of death undetermined, manner of death undetermined. And these undetermined cases are the most frustrating cases of all, because you don't provide closure to the family, and that creates open-ended questions that can never be solved. That case is 20 years old now, and I still wonder about her and what happened to her. On that night, she died. And that brings us to the end of the episode. I hope you learned something, and I hope you were entertained. Until the next time.